Welcome to Mex Moves, our weekly podcast on Mexico business and finance of interest to the global audience. How are you, Eduardo?
I'm doing well, Damian. How are you?
Great. Happy New Year.
Likewise.
Again, I think in Mexico you're allowed to say it until the end of January, right?
That's the rule.
Or maybe you're not allowed to say it more than once to the same person. But so this week, a week when President Trump said that USMCA was irrelevant to the US, we have a great interview with Odracir Barquera. He's the head of Mexico's Automotive Industry Association, and he's going to talk about why USMCA is extremely relevant to Mexico, of course, but also to the US, with the car sector by far the most important sector within USMCA. And before that, Eduardo, I think we're going to chat about the outlook for 2026 for a few key sectors, for media and telco, for aviation, airports, and for the consumer, and then wrap up with something on McDonald's celebrating its 40th anniversary in Mexico. So why don't we start with media? And telcos. It's going to be a pretty critical year as I see it. You've got two potential M&As that have been rumored and in some cases confirmed as possibilities. Rumor, which has not been confirmed, is that AT&T Mexico is for sale. And the other rumor related to that is that the front runner to buy it would be Televisa, presumably its cable and telecommunication arm and pay TV arm, Izzy. And that would be a very important kind of reconfiguration of the sector, which we've talked about before. And also, Telefónica's confirmed that it's put up for sale. Its Mexican businesses, it's also put up for sale all of its LATAM business ex-Brazil, and has already sort of successfully found buyers in Colombia and Chile and in other parts of the region. So we could see quite a significant reconfiguration if any of this happens. And my take, Eduardo, is that if Televisa buys, it will be a credible competitor, albeit much smaller, to American Mobile, because it will have both mobile and it will have fixed and it will have pay TV, and it will therefore be in a stronger position to basically offer the full gamut of services to customers, which you can't do now, and that will cut its customer acquisition costs, probably cut churn. It also has political power to take on American Mobile. That said, American Mobile has dominant market share, about 70% market share, and this is a business where high market share gives you huge benefits in terms of scale and able to spread your costs over more customers. So it's not going to be easy to take them on. And obviously we have to see if that transaction actually occurs. And apart from that, I think we've got the issue of everyone's phone in Mexico. Everyone's mobile phone now has to be registered with the relevant authority. And if it's not registered by June, it's going to be cut off. That's a gargantuous task anywhere, but especially in Mexico, where there's so much informality and many people don't have or don't want to reveal their tax IDs and their CURP IDs. So we'll see how that unfolds. But I think there's a real possibility that a lot of people register in time, and then the government will have to decide whether they really do cut off their lines or not.
They will, like many times in Mexico, they probably give you a 3 more reprisal to do it. Now, it applies mainly for those that don't have a pre-planned or a planned package, if I recall correctly. So, for instance, in my case, I haven't received any emails that I need to register. I think that I'm already there, so I'm already being scouted out. But the more important thing is the change of ownership in AT&T. One practical thing, Damian, I don't know how will that work for the clients of AT&T, because currently you have roaming in the States with AT&T because they've integrated their networks. I wonder what the conditions would be for what would happen if and when EC, the main candidate, takes over that enterprise. They will be competing with a formidable and very shrewd competitor up with American Mobile. So it'll be an interesting development. It's in a way it's a bit sad, I would say, that we're losing two competitors in a market that was meant to be more that was meant to attract more participants, and it didn't in the end. Although we still have the virtual mobile networks that are doing apparently quite well. So a lot of moving pieces in that industry that we'll have to keep an eye on them to see how it all falls up.
That's right. I mean, meanwhile, American Mobile, through Telcel, its subsidiary here, has cut its capex quite a lot in Mexico, and therefore is generating a lot more free cash flow. Stock market loves that. So the stock's done, over the course of last year, it did well for that and other reasons. It's also done well in other parts of Latin America, and so it's a pretty, it's a pretty favorable environment for the incumbent, with the number 2 and the number 3 player, either struggling or deciding to throw in the towel.
Oh.
Be interesting if Televisa really does buy it, whether they then go one stage further, as we've talked about, and spin off or separate their media business, Televisa Univision, from their telco business, spin it off to shareholders, and then basically you'll have, Televisa Univision, which is the content business. Then you'll have the telco and the cable TV business, Izzy, and then they've already spun off the football publishing and gaming business into Olemani. If that happens, that in a different way, of course, that would be a sort of similar corporate restructuring that we saw at Alpha, which split up into, and finally concluded at the end of last year, into Sigma, which has now been renamed Sigma, the food business, and then they have Alpec, the petrochemical business, and they have the car parts business. So they basically dismantled Alpha, and maybe Televisa will go down the same way. I think stock was up about 50% from very depressed levels last year, and maybe it was partly because of this kind of restructuring that the company began. And if you include the value at Olemani, the stock did much better, because if you held on to your Olemani, which you received as a Televisa shareholder, that stock more than doubled. So moving on to consumer, that was a pretty disappointing sector overall last year. Mexican consumer, despite the big minimum wage increases, was quite depressed, and some of the big consumer names like FEMSA and Walmart, significantly underperformed the stock market, as their same-store sales, were in low single digits. And there was, I think, pressure. There was a big fiscal adjustment last year in Mexico, with the fiscal deficit from the AMIA days went from 6% to just over 4%. That clearly didn't help consumption. GDP only grew by about 0.4% last year. Investment was weak. Formal employment generation, if you exclude the sort of effects of Uber and Didi, was also weak. And remittances are, of course, down last year, down in dollars, but also significantly down in pesos, because, of course, the peso was strong against the dollar. So I think this year, the question is, will consumption bounce back as some of those issues go away, if they do go away? The general consensus is no. Having read some of the Wall Street reports, Chedraui just issued its guidance for 2026, looking at 3 to 4% same-store sales growth in Mexico, which is actually slightly kind of below what they had, what they're going to get for 2025. Or the U.S., in their case, they're big in Southern California, has also been hit hard by U.S. immigration crackdown, and they're looking there at 1 to 2% same-store sales. So I think that the general view is that remittances is going to remain under pressure. Employment probably isn't going to grow too fast, with the flip side of the labor law reform, which is moving increasing labor costs for companies, both higher Social Security contributions, obviously higher minimum wage, which spreads out into many other wages, then the reduction in the working week from gradually to 40 hours from 45 hours or so. All of that makes it more expensive to hire people formally. So informal employment, it's probably gonna continue to grow faster than formal employment, even if these reforms long term are good for Mexico. And then you also have these for the bottlers, the soda drink. You have these excise taxes that the government put last year, allegedly to help Mexican slim down. Which is certainly something I need to do. But it's clearly going to make soft drinks, more expensive than they would otherwise have been, and that's going to curtail demand. Now, the flip side is we've got the World Cup, which is a sort of prevailing theme throughout the year. So there'll be a lot of drinking related to that, probably more hard drinks than soft drinks, I would imagine. But yeah, soft drinks as well. GDP growth is picking up. Interest rates are coming down as inflation behaves reasonably well. I think one of the kind of themes is Tiendas 3B is doing amazingly well in terms of sales. It's same-store sales sort of mid-teens versus the low single digits for the formal retailers. They have obviously smaller stores, much more private label, more than 50% is private label, many fewer SKUs. So we're seeing some of the other retailers kind of react to that. Chedraui, in its guidance, announced a sort of another 160 Supercito stores, which are sort of small stores, not totally different to a 3B store, with 2,500 SKUs and about 250 square meters. FEMSA has been aggressively growing Barra, which is its kind of hard version of a hard discounter. And Walmart is obviously focusing more on the Bodega Aurrera sort of mini formats. So you're seeing, a success of 3B, propel other companies to try and do something similar, but so far without a huge amount of success. And then in these retailers, especially like Walmart, with over 200,000 employees, the rise in the minimum wage and the reduction in the working week and the rise in Social Security contributions, all of which is a good thing for the country, probably is going to be pressuring their labor costs, and if they don't have enough pricing power, maybe their margins as well. What's your take?
Yeah, I mean, I think the consumer sector should be an indicator for the government in the sense. I mean, taking aside remittances and what you said about the fiscal consolidation that the government was able to accomplish, which is overall in the long term good. The consumer sector, I think, should be a little bit of a warning that maybe the benefits and the great accomplishment that the Mexican economy has reached with wage increases, double-digit wage increases for the last 7 or 8 years. It's getting to a point that it's hurting more than benefiting the people, because either they're not hiring formally or they're firing people because they can't pay them. They cannot transfer the higher labor costs to consumer products, and therefore they have to slim down, and therefore the income of families is not doing as well. We're reaching a point, I think, that consumers might not be as well off with such high increases in minimum wage as they could be with a slower increase above inflation, of course, as the Constitution now says, but not at a pace that it forces small and medium-sized companies to cut down on formal employment. And the consumer sector is showing you a little bit of that. And the fact that 3B and companies are focusing more on low costs shows you that that people, instead of going to the more expensive outlets, are looking for bargains because of purchasing power that is declining due to conditions of employment that are less than optimal.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, I think that private label, as we've seen in other parts of the world, especially Europe, is going to continue to grow market share in Mexico. So historically, brands have done really well in Mexico because of, I think perhaps a lack of trust in kind of unknown products. Obviously a pretty flaky legal system, and enforcement of a legal system means people kind of go to things that they trust and know about. But that's changing, and these companies like 3B have their own private label brands. Costco obviously has its Kirkland brand. They're also doing extremely well in Mexico. So I think you will see a continued migration from these brand companies that have gross margins of 40, 50% in many cases, to private labels, and the savings being passed on to a more cost-conscious kind of consumer for the reasons that you mentioned, and that won't be good, obviously, for the companies which, especially the mainly U.S. or international companies that have big brands, spend a lot of money on brands development and protection. And it probably won't be good for advertising either for those type of companies if you really do see a move to private label. Moving on to real estate. Real estate, I think if World Cup is a dominant theme for 2026, the other dominant theme is USMCA. And we're going to hear about more of that shortly from our guest today from the AMIA, from the Automotive Industry Association. But the industrial real estate, it's been weak because of this investment pause, this uncertainty related to USMCA tariffs in the automobile sector, which haven't hit investment and margins. So the big question there is, what will happen to USMCA? Will some of that uncertainty, I think with Trump, you'll never get to a point where all uncertainty is removed. But if some of that uncertainty is removed, then you'll get to see more investment and some weak markets. In Tijuana, Reynosa, Juarez, which have been relatively weak on the industrial side, will start to improve. I mean, notwithstanding that, the Fibras did well last year. They were up roughly 30%, as I think people had been discounting perhaps an even more negative scenario. And when Trump first became president, and then we saw some retreat on Liberation Day, and things didn't look as bad by April as they might, by late April as they seemed in the first part of the year. I think the other issue we're going to see is consolidation. We saw a little bit of consolidation with Prologis buying Terrafina over a year ago now, and that was very good for Terrafina shareholders and Prologis shareholders as well. And it's really kind of the only way to grow, in the sense that most of the Fibras are trading below their net asset value. So it's quite difficult for them to issue new equity without diluting shareholders. So there's a lot of Fibras. None of them are very liquid except for Fibra Uno. So maybe we'll see some more M&A. And I think we'll also see the continued trend to internalization, which basically is, as you know, means not paying fees to external parties, which are usually related parties in the case of Mexico's Fibras, and paying the fees within the Fibra or within the REIT, which is how it works in the US. Fibra Uno last year announced that it's internalizing its fees from January of this year, from this month, and obviously they IPO'd next. Their industrial Fibra, which is effectively part of Fibra Uno, and that's also internalized, and some of the other Fibras are already internalized, like Fibra Monterrey. So I think you'll see some trends there, and then I think we'll see maybe with the sort of return to work, return to office, continuing to gather steam. Some of the weakness in the office market in Mexico City might start to ease, and companies with big exposure to offices like Danos would benefit from that.
Well, I think the industrial side of the equation is very much tied to what happens with the USMCA. The talks about it. Like you said at the beginning, Trump says it's irrelevant. We say it's not. You say potato, I say potato. We don't know what's going to happen there. But maybe the U.S. and Mexico have established such a linkage that it will survive. Maybe it will take longer. Hopefully not. But we'll have to wait and see what the Trump administration decides to do. The affordable question about it's key here now that I'm in America. So we'll have to wait and see if Trump realizes that free trade can help him bring prices down rather than pick them up. Will be a key question. We'll have to wait and see.
That's right. I should, in case our listeners don't know, Eduardo is now based in San Francisco. He's a visiting professor, lecturer at Berkeley on journalism.
Correct.
Congrats on your new role. But will, fortunately for us, continue to be co-hosting the podcast with me. I think the other, interest rates are coming down, which is typically good for the real estate sector. So interest rates, a year ago were 10%. Really didn't make a lot of sense to invest in real estate when you could get 10% yield buying a government security overnight. Some people think rates will end this year at 6%, maybe 6.25%. But so it's definitely more interesting asset classes as government rates come down. Mexico had, among of sort of big economies, had probably the highest real interest rates in the world at the beginning of 2025, and finally that's getting sorted out as inflation is under control and the exchange rate is very strong, and with declining rates that should help all of Mexico, but it certainly should help the real estate sector. So moving on, finally to the final sector for this week. Well, next week I think we'll take a look at other sectors like mining and banks, but aviation and airports. I mean, as we talked about last week, the big question is going to be the merger between Volaris and Viva. That would give them, if it's approved, more than 70% market share of domestic flights. So for me, it's a real test of the competition authority, the new competition authority that's now part of the economy ministry. It's no longer constitutionally autonomous and independent. I think in a lot of countries, 70% market share would be considered too high. I'm sure they'll come up with lots of arguments why it makes sense, but it's going to be key. And both airlines in a way need it because their capacity is has been growing faster than their passengers, so the utilization has been going down, and that's terrible for an airline. It hits margins quite heavily, having those unsold seats on the airline. So it's definitely a challenging industry, and a merger of this nature would help address that, even if it may not be good for consumers from a sort of monopolistic market power perspective.
Yeah, it's going to be interesting to see, like we said last week, whether well, how do they justify this merger? Because, well, we had the president come up and say that it was a good deal. It was a good idea. But consumers might not. We might not be the happy ones in the end if they have pricing power, which they will with that percentage of market share that you just mentioned, Damian. On the other hand, the World Cup is coming, so there'll be probably a lot of people using those airlines. I mean, it's only in 3 cities in Mexico, but maybe some Mexicans will go to the States as well to watch games there too, especially in cities that are close to Mexico, LA, Dallas, Houston, even Miami has games. So they'll get a little boost from that, I would say.
So one of the things you mentioned, Eduardo, which I think is a good point, which is that rapid increase in air transportation in Mexico has mainly benefited the airports, not the airlines. Airports in Mexico have been, over the last 5 years, 10 years, 3 years, you name it, it's the best performing stocks in the market, with a couple of exceptions. This year, yet again, we're going to see tariff increases. OMA, the Monterrey Airport group, got I think a 7% tariff increase for 2026. Which is above inflation, which ended the year at about 4%. GAP had its increase approved the year before last, but not all of that increase was implemented. So the analysts are expecting another 10% increase. So these tariff increases have hit airline prices because you're paying sometimes when I buy a ticket to go to Guadalajara or Monterrey, especially if it's a lower cost ticket on the low cost airlines, the airport rate is often more than 50% of the total cost of the price. So they, with all that cash flow they've been generating from this highly favorable regulatory framework, we've seen them going on a buying spree outside Mexico. So this year, Azur is going to take the 20 South American airports it bought. That's a pretty big deal. It's 45 million passengers versus I think the 71 million passengers that Azur has today. So it's a 50% increase in its passengers. Now the passengers are way less profitable than the Mexican passengers, partly because of the very favorable regulatory environment that you have in Mexico for the airports. But their goal will obviously make those passengers more profitable, through the non-regulated tariffs, basically the ancillary revenues through the retail side and the car park side and so on. And then you've got GAP, which is the Guadalajara-led airport group, and they closed the CBX, the San Diego Tijuana Bridge transaction, which will also boost their non-regulated revenues by a significant amount. So we're going to see you're going to see basically transactions that have already been announced, and sort of also is buying the retail operations in Kennedy and other U.S. airports. So we're going to see these airports become much more global and less dependent on Mexico, having used this huge cash flow. They'll probably be kind of discreetly lobbying against the merger of Viva and Volaris, I would guess. Not that it affects the tariff, because the government sets the tariff, but one would expect that if they're merged, Viva and Volaris will cut kind of some unprofitable routes, which will hurt volume over time. So they may be losers if this merger goes through, and they certainly can't complain because they've had a very good run over the last decade from this good regulatory regime that they've had. That effectively the Mexican airline customers have been paying through these high tour rates. So that's it for those sectors. Eduardo, if we have a chance, we'll take a look at some other sectors' outlook for next year. Now, I saw a story in white paper this morning about McDonald's celebrating its 40th anniversary, 41st anniversary, I guess, in Mexico. There was a New York Times story in 1985 about McDonald's, and 41 years ago, McDonald's opening its first store. Do you remember that? You've been around a while, Eduardo?
Yeah, I do remember that store. It was on the side of the Periférico, one of Mexico City's main avenues. And the uproar that the arrival of McDonald's created back in those days. I was working at El Colegio de Mexico for a little while back then, and it was nearby, and you could see the line of cars parked on the side street of El Periférico with everybody waiting to have their Big Macs for the first time in Mexico. Everybody in New Mexico knew about McDonald's, and so it was a big event when they finally opened up 10 years before the free trade agreement, which is interesting. Just after a crisis, one of the many crises we faced in the 80s. But it's been a long way. Yeah, now they open up and nobody pays any attention.
Yeah, I sense that McDonald's as a brand has been far superseded as a global by Starbucks, right? If you think now of McDonald's, you think of kind of convenience, low cost, protein, but you don't think of it as a sort of exciting global experience, right? Whereas if you go to a which is probably when you were there back in 41 years ago, you probably did, right? This is amazing, and that so Starbucks has overtaken over. Starbucks doesn't sell coffee famously. It sells, a third way, an experience. The stores are nice. You hang out in the stores. It's an identity. It's a ritual. Whereas at this point, McDonald's is more about low cost protein than a good experience. So I think it's been overtaken, and I think Starbucks is. I mean, I read in white paper that McDonald's is about $500 million of revenues in Mexico, which is a good number, obviously. But I don't know the numbers, but my guess is that Starbucks, based on the number of stores it has and using a kind of rough metric of revenues per store, it's probably double. It's probably double McDonald's at this point, and obviously
Well,
Starbucks didn't.
the thing is that when McDonald's came, there were no American brands in Mexico. Burger King didn't exist. None of the traditional fast food places that you now see all over the country were here. Mexico was back then a very closed economy. And so the arrival of McDonald's was like a hint of something that was going to change in the country from an economics point of view. And so it was so exciting because we didn't have any US brands like that. And McDonald's was like, if not the most sophisticated place to eat, it was like, wow, we can now buy hamburgers, American hamburgers in Mexico. It was a big deal. It was huge. There were TV reporters. I mean, the New York Times covered it. So that's how big of a deal it was back then, because it meant something that the country was changing in a way, or was about to change.
Yeah, I'm back. I think Starbucks threw out there and launched in 2002, so 23, 24 years ago. And it wasn't a big deal, even though, and in fact, I was an equity analyst at that time. And I remember writing, Mexicans are never going to pay, 50 pesos, 40 pesos for a cup of coffee. This is, there's going to be 6 stores in Polanco and Las Lomas. And now I was obviously completely and totally wrong. And, I think Mexico is the second largest Starbucks market outside the US. It's probably $1 billion business or so. And it's been an absolute huge success. So the appetite for US brands remain strong. It's just moved on from McDonald's.
Cool, without a doubt. And back then, before Starbucks, Alsea had already brought Domino's Pizza and a few other names. So yeah, Starbucks was a big deal, but and it's very aspirational now. But I think the McDonald's, I think it was like in Russia, no? When the first McDonald's opened in Russia. Now, when the McDonald's have closed down in Russia. But when the first McDonald's, there was a big hoopla as well. Not that Mexico was a communist country like Russia was, but we had a very one-party rule system and a very close economy. So it was a big deal.
Terrific. Well, I think we can now move to our interview. It's a real pleasure to have with us today Odracir Barquera. Odracir is the CEO of the Asociación Mexicana de la Industria Automotriz. How are you, Odracir?
Good, thank you. How are you?
Very, very well. Happy New Year. And thank you very much for joining us. Odracir, we're here to talk about the Mexican car sector and auto parts sector. And I wanted to, maybe you could just kick off by telling us a little bit how important the sector, the automotive sector, is to the Mexican economy, and then give us your perspectives on how things went in 2025.
Sure. I think it's very important to highlight the relevance of the automotive industry in Mexico and in North America. And based on that, we can understand the impacts that the current global juncture is having on us. The Mexican automotive sector is the largest exporting sector in the Mexican economy and the sector with the most surplus in the trade balance. So we account for more than 30% of the total exports, Mexican exports, and we are the ones that balance the Mexican trade balance. There's a small deficit in the Mexican trade balance, but it's because of our surplus that we're not in a full deficit. But this is also the industry with the largest footprint in the Mexican domestic economy. First of all, because of our exports and because of the automotive balance, we account for more income than remittances and tourism put together. So we are 20 to 25% more than remittances and tourism put together. But we also have an impact on more than 60% of the economic activities in Mexico because of our large supply chain. No other industry has that reach. And we are the highest paying, we generate the highest paying jobs in the Mexican economy as well. So that's what's relevant about the industry in Mexico. But within North America, the automotive industry is the single largest component of total USMCA trade. We represent between 20 to 25% of total trade. That means that we are the largest player and we are the industry that attracts most of the investment in terms of manufacturing. That being said, 2025 was a very challenging year because of the tariff juncture, because of the new policies put in place by the US government. And the Mexican auto industry performed much more stable than we were anticipating and than most of us were anticipating. We had a slight decrease of 0.9% in production and a decrease of 2.3% in exports. This is not a bad outcome if you take into account that 2024 was the historic record for both production and exports. So we are comparing to the highest, to the high performance indicators. But if you look at it in a different way, this was the first year that we were not growing. And this is an industry that has been growing for the last 30 years at least, except for the pandemic, which was a global issue. So that's an issue of concern. The fact that we did not grow for the first time this year, and this is because of the tariff juncture. So how we see 2026, we're not sure. It'll depend on what is discussed in terms of tariffs, and it'll depend a lot on how the USMCA review ends up.
Before we get to the review and what your expectations are, maybe you could just explain to the audience the current tariff situation for Mexican cars and auto parts, and how does Mexico's tariff situation and exposure compare to that of European and Asian countries?
Sure. The U.S. imposed, as of April 3rd of 2025, a 25% tariff on the automotive industry worldwide based under Section 232. Now, for the case of Mexico, at the beginning, there was a preferential treatment where for vehicles, you can exempt the U.S. content from that tariff for USMCA compliant vehicles. So your tariff actually goes towards the percentage of the vehicle that is non-USMCA content. So on average back then, it was said that about 38 to 40% of the vehicle was U.S. content of a Mexican-made vehicle. So your 25% would go towards the roughly 60% that is non-US content. However, it's not that easy. Things are more complicated than that because you have to calculate model by model. You can't calculate just an industry average. And things vary a lot between models. So the guidelines for documenting the US content and for applying for the exemption were not published until early June. So as of April 3rd, you were paying 25% full. And then once the guidelines were published, you would be able to apply for the exemption and for a retroactive reimbursement. Because the guidelines that were published in early June were not very easy, companies didn't start applying for the exemption until mid to late July. The reality is that not many models have been able to get their exemptions approved. And those models that have already been accepted in terms of US content, none of them have been able to get their retroactive reimbursement yet. Now, we need to keep in mind that with the guidelines, one of the things that they established is that you have to apply every 6 months for your exemption. So this will be an ongoing process, model by model, and those that got the exception first will almost be reaching those 6 months soon, and they have to apply 1 month before, and it hasn't been easy. So the reality is that most of the models as of April 3rd have been paying a full 25%. Those that have been able to document their US content are not necessarily going all the way down to the 15% that was originally calculated, because it depends a lot on the model. Now, in terms of auto parts, it's a little bit easier. The agreement is that USMCA compliant parts are 0% tariff, and those make up probably 65% of total Mexican auto parts exports. So that's an easier scenario. And you still have to see how much of the remaining 35% you can easily certificate as a USMCA compliant. So that's where we are right now. Now, once the US negotiated agreements with the European Union, Japan, and South Korea, Mexico was put at a disadvantage, because those three agreements set a 15% flat tariff for everything coming from those countries and region. Now, Mexico is at a disadvantage, one, because we have to comply with all the origin requirements under USMCA, meaning the rules of origin, which are the highest in any free trade agreement, 75%, meaning the labor value content, which is something that is not considered in any other free trade agreement, and with the 70% purchases of steel and aluminum within the region, which is also not considered in any other free trade agreement. We still have to comply with all of those in order to be able to apply for the US content exemption, which, as I said, is very complicated to achieve. Whereas the European Union, Japan, and South Korea can send their cars with no requirements, simply paying a 15% tariff. So that is having a big impact. And that is one of the things that we want to focus on in terms of the tariff discussions.
What are you expecting for the USMCA review? I mean, are you expecting the tariffs to be removed? Are you expecting these kind of emergency tariffs to be put into USMCA? What's your gut feeling on how things are going to unfold?
Well, first of all, this is not going to be an easy review. It wasn't going to be easy from the beginning, but it's much more complicated now that we have this new tariff structure by the US. We expect proposals by the US to make the rules of origin more restrictive, but we don't know how and how much. We expect changes in the labor chapter, but we don't know how and how much. And in terms of tariffs, our demand as the auto industry and the request by the Mexican government is that tariffs get eliminated and we go back to the USMCA context of 0% trade with whatever is USMCA compliant. Whether or not that's going to happen, we don't know. That's the reality. And that's what's creating an uncertainty in this industry, as in many other industries, towards a review. Now, the review, as I said, is not going to be easy. We're not sure that it will be completed by July 1st. We also have to consider that. The problem is that the longer we are under this uncertainty, the harder it is for companies to make important decisions.
Odracir, how are you? Eduardo here. Happy New Year to you too. So, taking into account all you've told us, which is quite striking in the sense that these tariffs to Mexico hurt mostly U.S. companies, if I may say so. It doesn't make a lot of sense, but I guess the Trump administration wants to bring back manufacturing and thinks he will do it with those tariffs, and he doesn't care so much of Japan and Korea and the European Union because it's far away. Am I right to say that? And how could you convince the U.S. administration that that's not the right way to do things?
I think that the tariffs are having a negative impact on any company that chose, any automotive company that chose to invest in North America and in Mexico specifically. Not just the US companies, but the Japanese companies, the German companies, the South Korean companies that have production activities in Mexico, because the basis for such a strong industry in Mexico was NAFTA and the North America regional integration. So that was the business model under which all these companies decided to expand their investments in Mexico and in North America. So the new tariff structure affects all of them. How to convince the U.S. administration, we're not sure. We've been working on this for the last almost year, and it's proven to be quite complicated. Now, I do believe that to some extent, they recognize the importance of USMCA for the U.S. economy. And it is because of that throughout these last few months, they have granted some preferential treatment to USMCA goods. But it's not enough. And it still goes against the spirit of this integration. And in our opinion, it goes against the competitiveness of the region, including the U.S. At a time in the world where regions are the way to compete. And at a time when the U.S. wants to compete, particularly with the Asia region, particularly with one country, and the only way to do so is by working together, not by working as islands. So it's a complicated context. I know that some in the U.S. administration fully understand it. Some others understand it, but are not necessarily in agreement with it. So it's a complicated scenario right now.
And let me ask you about what has happened to prices of Mexican-made cars in the United States? Have companies transported the increase in tariffs to consumers, or are they absorbing them? What can you tell us? And I'm thinking of this question regarding the impact that these tariffs may have on consumers and the administration's concerns about inflation and affordability that are key in today's political world in the United States.
Let me start by saying that tariffs have lasted much longer than anyone anticipated. So at the beginning, all throughout last year, it was a wait-and-see situation for companies. Most companies, not just auto, but consumer products and other companies, didn't want to transfer the tariff cost to the end consumer. That's not sustainable. That was throughout last year. It was longer than they expected, but that's not sustainable. So at some point, prices are going to go up. And you have seen some inflation in the US at the end of last year. Specifically for vehicles, for the auto market in the US, the average price of a vehicle had already significantly increased after the pandemic. So before the pandemic, the average price was $35,000. After the pandemic, it was $45,000. As of now, it's $50,000. The US consumer is not willing to pay that price. And if prices start going up because of the tariff impact, it will be a complicated issue for the US market. It already started to get complicated. Used cars are increasing in value because people are looking at used cars more than new cars, or starting to look more at used cars. So that's not going to be good for the US market. And it's not going to be good for us because we produce mainly for the US market.
Correct. No, it consumes nearly 80% of your exports, if I may say so. Now, in that sense, I was surprised of how well the industry performed, considering the circumstances that you've just described. What have you guys done that has allowed you to almost keep production at the same level as last year and only saw a 2.3% decline in exports? That's quite an accomplishment under the circumstances you've been facing.
It's part of the wait and see. I mean, as I said, it was more stable than all of us anticipated. But what's relevant here is that we're not growing. We actually decreased a little bit. And that's not good. That's not a good forecast for 2026, because 2026, we're going to be seeing probably more impacts because of the uncertainty and because of how long we've been under this uncertainty. So I think 2025 was a relatively stable year also because in the US market, they were in the wait and see mode as well. So sales didn't go down, they remained stable, but we're not sure if that's going to be the same case during this year.
Given that, before this announcement yesterday of GM saying they're going to invest $1 billion in Mexico, why do you think OEMs are still investing so heavily when the tariffs are in place? The outlook for USMCA doesn't look too great.
Well, first, I would say that you can see a pause in investments throughout 2025 in the auto industry. You can see it in the public numbers, and this is because of the uncertainty. So these companies have invested a lot throughout these 30 years in Mexico, and they are so consolidated in Mexico that it's difficult to stop investing just like that. But they're not investing as much. So I don't foresee a lot of investments until we know what happens with the USMCA review. I foresee continuity, regular continuity of the investments that they already have in place, because in the end, they still need to keep everything in shape, and they still need to complete some of the plans that they have in Mexico. But that doesn't mean that we're going to be seeing significant investments throughout this year.
Understood. And moving to Chinese produced cars that are being sold into the Mexican market, how are you seeing the Chinese exporters impacting the Mexican automobile market? And do you think that will change with these tariff increases that came at the end of last year?
Well, there's obviously been an increase in Chinese brands in Mexico. Because we need to remember that one thing is Chinese-made vehicles imported into Mexico, and another thing are Chinese brands bringing their cars into Mexico, because some traditional or legacy automakers also bring cars from China into Mexico. So the presence of Chinese brands in Mexico is obviously growing. What we have been saying publicly is any company that wants to participate in the Mexican market has to do so by fully complying with the legal and regulatory framework in Mexico, number one. And number two, has to be able to guarantee after-sale services to the consumers. So that's the biggest challenge. And a third component is they need to be transparent. They need to publicly report their sales numbers, as all the companies that are already established in Mexico do. It's a difficult situation in terms of competition, and that is one of the reasons that the tariffs were imposed by Mexico to imports from countries with no free trade agreement, one of them being China. This is an action by the Mexican government to level the playing field in Mexico. How big of an impact it will have, we don't know. We have to see. They just started applying as of January 1st. So we'll see how the market behaves in the next few months with the new tariffs in place.
On that comment, Odracir, and before we wrap up, you welcome any participant that follows the rule of law. Yet it seems like the U.S. is pressuring Mexico to try not to encourage Chinese auto parts and investment in the country. How do you combine the two elements for the benefit of the two countries?
I think we're talking about two different things. One thing is the domestic market, and another thing is all our production for exports. When you look at production in Mexico, first of all, you have no Chinese automakers producing in Mexico. Vehicles. There's no production. There's only one small investment that has been around for several years. This is not a new investment. It's an assembly plant. It's not a manufacturing plant. And they only produce between 20 and 30,000 vehicles a year for the domestic market. 20 to 30,000 vehicles a year, when your total production is 4 million, is insignificant. That's for vehicles. In terms of auto parts, out of the total production of auto parts in Mexico, roughly 5% is Chinese investment related. So it's a very small percentage. Now, when you look at the imports of auto parts into Mexico, more than 55% of our imports come from the US, and roughly 12 to 14% come from China. So the reality is that our production platform for exporting is very concentrated on North America content because we already comply with a 75% rule of origin. So the Chinese presence in our supply chain is not that big. Domestic market, that's a different thing. It's been growing, but these are vehicles that stay in Mexico. These are not vehicles that will eventually be exported to other countries.
Correct. Well, Brazil, this is fascinating. It's a fascinating and changing industry. We hope for the best with these talks on the USMCA that Mexico will face this year. And we hope for the best for the sector, which you clearly described at the beginning. It's of crucial importance for the Mexican economy, the Mexican people, and for everybody, I would say. Thank you.
Thank you to both of you.
Thank you very much for joining Mex Moves. Please subscribe, leave comments, and look forward to you tuning in next week. Thank you, Eduardo.
Thank you, Damian. Thank you, everyone. We'll be back next week. Hope you enjoy it.